Hello and welcome to another video. Today we're going to make Ragu napolitano. Now, Ragu napolitano's, in my view, kind of one of the highest cuisine ragus in Italian cooking. This is a dish which is designed to produce a multi-course meal. You can dress it up as much as you like. You can also make a simpler version. I'm making something on the simpler side today, but this is absolutely phenomenally delicious. Now, of course, ragu is a meat stew with lots of tomatoes, which is thick and served on pasta. This is the way to always think about it. And in this particular case, we are going to basically start with a big bunch of different oils and fats, mix them together with the sauce, stew meats in it, create this delicious sauce, and meat that's just tender and, delicious. So let's go ahead and get started. So, wow, there are a lot of ingredients. I'm going to go through these in a couple different phases so that I don't overwhelm you. The first is we need a mixture of animal fat and olive oil. So I have, you can use lard, you can even use schmaltz, but animal fat, about 100 grams, olive oil, about 200 milliliters, onions, I'm going to use all three of these, thyme, and then, of course, we have the tomatoes. So we have basically crushed tomatoes. Passata is what they call it in Italian, I think. Tomato puree, basically. And then we have tomato paste. Next, I'll cover the meats and the selection of the meats and why they're important. And then we can go ahead and get started. So now the meats. And I guess I'll cover the red wine also. One thing that almost everybody agrees on is that a mixture of beef and pork is best. And you want to use cuts of meat that go well in stews. So here I have pork spare ribs. And a lot of recipes will call for chuck. But in this case, I've decided to go a bit further and use shank. The thing about shank is, if you look at it, you have all this gristle in it. And that is really bad when you're trying to, say, grill it like a steak. But it's really, really good in a dish like this because all this gristle is going to just slowly cook in and it's going to melt in your mouth. And it's going to give that sauce an extra richness that you would not get with a less tough cut of meat. So you really want to use the really tough cuts for this. You can use some kinds of chuck, but I think shank is really good. Then, of course, people will use, typically you'd use an Italian pancetta, but I couldn't find any of that, so I'm using chopped bacon and prosciutto. And both of these are going to give it a little bit more of a rich flavor. And finally, I have a nice full-bodied red, dry Italian wine. And all this is going in. This is going to make the most incredible pasta sauce you've probably ever had. Before I begin, though, one thing I forgot to mention is that these bits of bone marrow also qualify as animal fat. So I'm going to pull them out. And I'm going to use them in the initial fat combination also. I think bone marrow is really good, and I can't think of any reason you wouldn't use it like this. So, just going to pull this out, and then these will go into the fat combination at the beginning. So the first step is combining the animal fats. Now, when you have an unrendered fat like this bone marrow, you probably want to cut it up a little bit. Bone marrow does render it down almost all the way, so you'll only end up with some very, very, very small pieces, but this is really, really good. I would strongly recommend this. Also, if you use lard and bone marrow, from the shank, you're going to get the same mixture of animal fats that you would get from the meats themselves. So I'm going to start with that, and then to that I'm going to add about 200 milliliters of. This doesn't have to be perfectly precise. This recipe is not one of those that. This is one of those recipes that that demands sort of care and attention over a long period of time, much more than it demands precision. So you don't have to be terribly precise on the measurements, but what you have to do is you have to be willing to pay attention to it for a long time. A bit more. A little more. And there we go. A lot of this. Now, one thing you're going to notice is that I'm making a whole lot of this. And it's not because I'm having tons of people over and I'm feeding lots of people. It's because this dish is hard to scale down and it freezes well. So you can take the meats and so forth out of it afterwards and, you know, coat them in sauce and freeze them along with the sauce, and it's fine. So make more than you expect to use and go that way. So I've already julienned one of the onions. I'm going to go ahead and julienne the rest of them. Basically, every dish that calls itself a napolitano has in common this idea that it's very mostly a onion dish with some other things in it. These are large amounts of onions that are cooked down, caramelized with meats and tomatoes, sometimes with tomatoes. Not all Napolitanos have tomatoes, like Napolitano Genovese doesn't. But anyway, I'll come back once all this is done and cooking, and you'll be able to see kind of where we are. So you can see this is a lot of onions, very large amount of onions. I've turned this on to about a 5 out of 9. And we're going to go ahead and let that start to cook. Once it starts to fry, I'm going to start to stir it. Once the onions start to really cook down, I'm going to add the meat. And we'll cook all of this together as the onions caramelize and the meat cooks through before we add the tomatoes. And when we add the meat, we'll also add the thyme. So this has been cooking for a few minutes. Once it cooks a little bit further and the onions start to get a bit softer, then I'll start to add the meat. So I guess I should prepare the shank now. And when I add the shank, I will also add the prosciutto and the bacon, and then I'll add the pork ribs a bit later. So with shank, you really want to make sure that you have nice, good-sized pieces. But it's also good to kind of follow the natural cut of the meat. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to cut this here. I'm going to slice right here. I have one piece. Then I'm going to just cut the bone out of the rest of this piece. If I want to, I can also cut this here. But it's not necessary. I'm going to let this bone stew in it also. It's not so important with this one, but you do get a little bit of meat on the side. With this one, since you have more marrow, it's definitely more important. I want to show you this. This is a big piece of tendon here that's embedded in the sort of these hard proteins. And a lot of people will cut that out because, you know, maybe it'll still be tough. Definitely don't do that. Since we're going to stew this for a very long time, that tendon's going to be really important in developing the flavor and richness of this broth, of the sauce. As a note on this, the sauce itself is going to have this very meaty aspect to it. Even though you won't be able to see meat in the sauce itself, or at least not very much. And here we go. These are looking much more much more transparent. And so I guess I'll add the meat now. So I've turned this down from about a 5 to about a 3. Now I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to do two things. I'm going to set the shank into the onions. Then I'm going to add the bacon. And I'm going to add the thyme. So with the bacon, it's fairly simple. I'm just going to add, this doesn't need to be that precise. So I'm just going to add it all, because why not? And then I'm going to, if you're going to use thyme, you really want to use fresh thyme. Don't use the dried stuff. In Naples, they use a slightly different spice, but it's similar. So if you don't have it, then just omit it. Dried thyme has a very, very stronger, sort of harsher flavor. And you might be able to do okay with just a little bit, but I'm going to keep stirring this periodically as these cook down. And then I'll add the pork. Although I kind of forgot, let me add the prosciutto. So here I have 70 grams of prosciutto. I'm just going to go ahead and add it all. And this will basically disintegrate as it cooks. So I'll come back later as this continues to cook down. So now this has been cooking for a while. You can see this meat is mostly done, so I've just put these back in so that they can stew. And I'm going to add my pork. And I'll let this cook again for a bit longer. Let the onions continue to cook down a bit. And then I will start to add then I will add the wine, and then I will add the tomatoes. So now I've been cooking this for almost 2 hours. And what you're going to see is that this brown sauce here that's just coming up, this is very typical. It happens sometimes. Some recipes won't mention it, but some will. Now in a Genovese, or a Napolitano Genovese, which is a kind of funny word because it means something from a Genovese thing from Naples. But what you're going to see is that sometimes this brown sauce comes up, and that's fine. This is actually kind of part of the charm of a Napolitano. This is where a lot of the meat flavor is. And so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to add the wine, and then I'm going to add the tomatoes. And then we're just going to let everything stew in here for like another 3 hours or so. So not about a quarter of a bottle of this wine. And I'm going to bring this to a nice boil. I'm going to start to add the tomatoes. Wow, that's looking good. Now, from this point onward, what's really important is to keep it just barely bubbling. I'm going to add one thing of this tomato paste. Then I'm going to add a thing of the crushed tomatoes. And I'll alternate like that until I have at least 3 and 3, and then I'll see whether I want to add a fourth. So I've added 3 of the 200-gram tubes of tomato paste and all 4 of the boxes of crushed tomatoes. This is going to be good. This is going to be really good. Now I'm going to go ahead and bring it up to just a bare simmer. I'm going to let it simmer for like another hour. Then I'm going to put the lid on so that it partly covers it and just let it continue to just slowly cook the meat. What's going to happen as you cook the meat is that the harder proteins are going to break down, and they're going to come into the sauce and thicken it up a bit, while the flavors of the meat are also going to enter into the sauce. So what you're going to end up with is a very meaty, rich sauce with lots of olive oil and animal fat in it, and lots of, you can see it starting to boil there. So I'm going to turn this down to about a 3. I've moved it back onto a larger burner because you're going to do better on this case with a larger burner on a slower heat. But yeah, this is going to be delicious. And then in about 3 hours, I will take the meat out. And then basically we just reduce this sauce until it no longer holds the oil. And that's when we know it's done. This is going to be delicious. So after something like an hour or something, it's been boiling nicely. You want it just to bubble just like this, just barely. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to partially cover this to keep the steam on and keep it from slowly drying out. We want to dry it out later, but we don't want to dry it out while it's cooking the meat. So this may not be perfect, but given the lid that I have, I'm just gonna prop it open a little bit. And just gonna let it cook like this for another 2 or 3 hours, and then it should be good. Now you can see it's been about 3 more hours, and this is still barely bubbling. This fat is pooling up on the top. That's fine. Again, remember, once you have a really thick layer of fat, the sauce is probably done. But this may take a few more hours, and I don't know if it will get done before it gets dark. So if not, then we pick it up tomorrow. So the next step is here, I'm actually going to pull the meat out. And the reason I'm going to pull the meat out is if you leave the meat in, it will all just kind of disintegrate, which is fine if you really like all that together. But if you want a really nice dish, then I would suggest, having the meat separate so you can serve it that way. So here we go. I'm going to start pulling the pieces out. And I'm going to put them on a plate to start with, and then I'll put them in containers for storing. Typically at the end of this, I will be freezing some of it. So, but look at this. So there's a piece of shank. Pull out the ribs. One thing that everybody who makes this dish seems to agree is that a mixture of beef and pork is ideal. If you don't eat pork, then I guess you can just do beef. But this is you can see how tender the meat and falling off the bone the meat is. But if you don't eat pork, you can just do it with beef. But a mixture of pork and beef is said to give the best flavor. Now, as this is kind of like a high cuisine dish, if you feel like you kind of need to, you know, if you're planning to eat it with somebody else, maybe you want to separate off the different types, so that either you can give each person a choice of meat entrees, or so that you can both eat the same thing. And you're going to notice that some of this is probably a little bit more done than I probably would have expected or I would have liked, but it's still going to be delicious. So if it's falling off the bone, that's fine. Yeah, you can see this one's just falling off the bone. That's fine. Somebody will get a piece without much bones. And I can pull these out or not. Now with meat that's this heavily cooked, it's going to freeze, and it's going to freeze and reheat relatively well. But there are a couple tricks that I'll go over. The biggest one is to avoid freezer burn. You want to freeze it in the sauce and then reheat the two of them together. I'll go over that in a moment. Yeah, this looks like more meat. All right, I think we have it all. So now I'm going to take the I'm going to leave the lid off, and I'm going to let this just kind of cook down for like another hour or two, and maybe longer. And as it does, it's eventually going to separate from this oil. You can see that's already kind of beginning. So maybe we'll be lucky and this will only take another hour. And once you have a nice good layer of oil on top, then it's done. And so now this has been cooking for about another hour or so, and you can see this nice layer of fat on the top. That means that this is effectively done. So I'll pull this off. It's starting to get dark, so I'm going to go ahead and pick this up, and we'll do the final reheating and presentation tomorrow. Anyway, this is going to be absolutely delicious. Enjoy. So with the napolitano, regardless of when you make it, and even if you serve it immediately, you'll probably want to reheat the meat. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a piece of shank, and you know, shank's a rich meat, so it doesn't take that much for a person. And I'm just going to put it in a bowl, in a pot. I'm going to scoop a bit of the napolitano on top. And you'll want to stir it up a little bit first because of the layer of fat on top. Having some of the fat's not a bad thing, but you don't want to have too much. And then, doesn't take a lot for a portion. And then I'm going to go ahead and put this on kind of maybe 3 or 4. So medium low. And I'm just going to let this warm up. At the same time, I'm going to heat up my pasta. And in terms of the pasta, again, we start with water, we salt it really well, and from there we are going to add the pasta in a few minutes. I've salted it well. My pasta that I've chosen is a linguine. It doesn't take a huge amount per person. This is a very rich sauce. So I've gone ahead and just grabbed a small amount. I'll put it in my water. I'll come back as soon as we are at the al dente phase. And for garnish, I've picked a small leaflet from the lovage plants I have. I really like lovage for this because the leaves have kind of this nice green texture to them. They hold their shape. You could use a flat leaf parsley, but this is a little more unusual, and it has a very wonderful flavor that's halfway in between parsley and celery. So it actually adds a little bit there. Of course, if I was like plating this, I would put a nice veggie on it as well. But for this demonstration, I'm not going to do that. So now I'm ready to plate it. You can add Parmesan cheese, but I'm not going to today. And if you want to do a multi-course meal, you would take the meat out and you would put it back in the pot and just keep the lid on it until you're ready for that. But as it is, I'm just going to set the meat right there on the side and let the sauce on it. It'll provide a nice little flavor. Then I'm going to add the noodles for this bit of sauce. And from there, I will add them to my plate. So it doesn't take that many noodles, but I'm going to add all the noodles I have here. This will be good. And one of the reasons we take the noodles off, that burned, is that they continue to cook a little bit here. So if you wait until they're done perfectly, by American standards, they'll be kind of mushy, and nobody likes that. So here we go. Now, so unlike sort of the way a lot of cases you may be used to thinking of pasta, instead of like a large portion of pasta, this would be a smaller portion, typically eaten first. And I like to just kind of take my tongs and swirl it, so you have something kind of like that. And then from there, we will go ahead and garnish it. You know, put this leaflet up, and there we have it. The Neapolitan ragu. I have space on here for a veggie, but for this demonstration, I'm not going to do that. And so now for the taste test. I'm going to take a little bit of the meat. I'm going to try it. And again, note, shank is usually a super tough meat, but here I'm able to just cut it with a fork. This meat is just super rich, very flavorful. The flavors of the wine and the tomatoes and stuff have all permeated the meat. It's just delicious. And now for the pasta. What's really interesting about the pasta sauce is you don't really see it because it just looks like a red sauce. But the flavor is actually pretty complex, and it's actually a really rich meaty sauce. So this is absolutely delicious. Hope you enjoy it. Bon appetit.